All right, I think we are back, and I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session for the next 45 minutes or so on building equity through MICIP. Just a few comments by way of introduction before we get into the content. So the intent of today's presentation is obviously not to teach everything about MICIP. We know that equity is a very complex concept about which there is a lot to be learned. And that certainly can't be addressed in only about 45 minutes. And even this overview presentation that we're going to engage with today is actually part of a longer 3-hour presentation. So the intent today is to help you start to make connections between equity and the specific components of MICIP, so that when you're engaging with MICIP, you have some additional considerations and conversations to consider. So this is a process that takes time. It's not going to happen with 1 or 2 conversations, but it is also important to remember that the conversations are meant to be integrated into the work itself and not be standalone conversations. This presentation is also not meant to be exhaustive in terms of making those connections. There are many others that could be made in addition to what I'm going to share today, but I'm hoping to highlight what I'll call some of those bigger ideas related to the specific MICIP components. And finally, it's also not meant to provide answers, but really to suggest questions, some reflection questions that teams might need to engage in as they're considering equity in the context of the continuous improvement work. So with that, let's talk first of all about, so what is it that we're talking about when we talk about equity? So you see a couple different definitions on the screen. First of all, you see that definition in the purple circle there, that it's the process that, first of all, that recognizes that advantages and barriers exist, and then makes that commitment to actually correct and address that imbalance. Okay. And you'll notice at the top, it also says that equity is essential for diversity and inclusion. So what does that mean? So you see there that diversity is really a fact of life. Okay. Diversity just is the presence of difference within a given setting. It's a fact of life. It's really not disputable. But then inclusion is what happens as a result of that. So what happens when we're addressing those various differences? So inclusion, therefore, as you see, is there people with different identities that feel valued and leveraged and welcomed in whatever that setting is that you're dealing with. And so again, in order to have diversity and inclusion, you need to have equity. And again, in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that diversity and inclusion are really the outcomes of a system that operates with equity. Someone once said that diversity is being asked to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. Okay, so if you're there, you are part of potential diverse populations, but it's the level of involvement and engagement that really comes with inclusion. So there are a couple of resources. There's a blog and a video that addresses this concept a little bit more in depth. And I'm not going to show those today, but I offer those there to you as a resource if you'd like to dig into this relationship a little bit more deeply. At the bottom of this screen, you also see a definition for equity that comes out of the Great Lakes Equity Center. Dr. Sina Skelton, who was our keynote at last year's Continuous Improvement Conference and who is going to be returning to this year's conference, works with and is actually the head of the Great Lakes Equity Center. And so I'm going to give you just a second to actually read that definition to yourself. And this definition really is a little bit more, is a little bit closer to the work that we are all engaged in terms of the educational setting. And so this is what in part drives the rest of the conversation that we're going to have today. So you'll see what we've also done, and I want to give credit to Jan Callis, one of our colleagues from Oakland Schools, for designing this diagram. So again, we have to keep in mind that even diversity and inclusion are not the end goal, but rather they are the bridge to between equity and what we're going for in our continuous improvement process, so to innovation and improvement. So diversity hopefully introduces a variety of talents, which then leads to a diversity of ideas. And then it's those ideas that if we value them, if we take them seriously, then we'll end up with inclusion, which then will hopefully lead to innovation and improvement. And that obviously is the work that we're engaged in when we're talking the continuous improvement process. So starting out with the basis of the continuous improvement process, which is really the vision, mission, and beliefs of an organization. And at the top here, you see again what we define the vision and mission and beliefs are. At least this is in the context of MICIP that we're working with. And again, you might see some variations on this theme, but really this is what's driving our definition in terms of MICIP. And it's also really important to recognize that there are two applications when we're talking about vision, mission, and beliefs. So certainly there is that organizational application or that organizational work. And when we talk about it at the organizational level, then we have questions such as those that are on the screen. So what is the why of the organization? And as an entire organization, to what extent does it understand and is it committed to equity work? Okay, so not only in knowing about it, but to addressing it as well, getting back to that previous slide. And then to what extent is that commitment a lived part of the culture of the entire organization, as well as its policies and practices? The other thing that's really critical for all of this work is not just to describe it, but really to identify, so what is the evidence that it's either there or it's not there? And this also gets part of the evidence when we're actually working in the MICIP process as well. So as we will see in just a minute, when we're talking about assessed needs, it's not just assessed needs in terms of the whole child needs, but it's also organizational in terms of this equity piece. Mission, vision, and beliefs, though, also apply to the individuals who work for the organization, because it's those individual beliefs that really drive the organizational beliefs. So we talked about the why of the organization. So when we're talking about the individuals, that personal work, what's the attitude of the individual staff members toward equity? And consequently, then, to what extent have they examined their own individual biases and their own individual belief systems, including about other adults, about children, and about their ability to learn, just for instance, okay? So again, it's important when we're talking this concept of vision, mission, and beliefs that we include not only the organizational context, but also those individuals that work for the organization, because the beliefs of the individuals are what's going to actually come out into the actual practices of the organization. So then we have the Mykit Mindset, and if you've been engaged with MICIP for a while, you probably recognize these. Actually, 4 parts, 4 components to the mindset. And again, you see equity as an isolated, as a separate component, but in many ways, equity is the lens through which we look at the other 3 components as well. And so what I'd like to do is to take just a few minutes and to say, so as we're considering the components of the Mykit Mindset, what are some of those equity considerations that we might want to make? So again, when we're talking about equity overall, and again, this is the lens through which we look at those other 3, the key question around equity is the one that's at the bottom. So do all students and adults receive the opportunities, environments, and supports based on what they need, rather than on simply equal distribution? And you've probably seen a variety of images of equity compared to equality. This is just another one of those that's meant to illustrate that. So taking a brief tour of each of these individual components of the mindset. First of all, in terms of continuous improvement. So really 2 key components, as we've said in the past. when we're talking about the mindset of continuous improvement. So the first is moving from that annual to ongoing cycles of improvement, as well as, and in this case, we're really going to focus on the part that's the district-wide community of improvement, as opposed to the schools and the district operating in isolation from each other. And two of the key questions in this context might be those that you're seeing right here. So first of all, so to what extent is our continuous improvement team representative of the population that it serves? Okay, and so as we just look at membership, and on the previous slide about these mindset elements, these components, we said that the mindset does two things, among other things. It really identifies the data that we need to take a look at, but it also identifies who's engaged in the continuous improvement process. And so I'm really trying to call that out here. And then not only who's on the team, but kind of getting back to that personal work around the vision, mission, and beliefs. To what extent can the continuous improvement team members use that equity lens to both understand and participate in the entire continuous improvement process? Okay. And again, I think it's critical as we talk about this to say, so what's the evidence of whether they can or they can't? And as part of the getting ready process for engaging in continuous improvement by the team, what are some of those professional learning pieces that we need to put in place in order to get them to the point where they say that yes, they can use that equity lens. And again, recognizing that it's an ongoing piece, it's not going to happen all in one professional learning, it's ongoing learning. Okay. So then let's talk about the whole child. And of course, the whole child is just short form for saying whole school, whole community, whole child. And those are really critical pieces to the entire equity puzzle as well. And so again, you see at the top the definition that we've been using for the whole child, not only addressing the academic, but addressing the physical, social, emotional, and behavioral needs of students and adults. And I think that and I want to just emphasize for a minute that piece of adults also, because sometimes we forget about that. We talk about whole child being just the child, but the needs of adults that are engaged in the system are really critical, really a critical part to that as well. So then I've identified three questions, again, that come through that equity lens in terms of specifically being related to the whole child. So the first one, how can we leverage the components of the WISC model to ensure equitable opportunities and environments for all learners? Kind of gets back to that original definition of equity. In terms of the environment, so to what extent can we provide that physically and emotionally safe and positive school climate, again, for all students, not just for some, and the word all here is really critical when we're talking about the equity lens. And again, how do we know? And then to what extent are we willing to differentiate the supports that students need through whether that's the equitable distribution of resources, including the areas of all the areas of the whole child. So I know that learning styles, for example, isn't nearly in vogue as what it used to be, but even back in the days when we were talking about learning styles, considering how different students learn, for example, considering how different students approach the learning process. So when we think about those other components of the whole child, do we give all of them weight based on knowledge of individual students and what individual students need, and how those whole child factors play into the lives of our individual students? And then in terms of systems thinking. So again, you see our definition at the top here. I'm not going to read it. Just talking about kind of those two different levels of systems, those that are most directly impactful on our teaching and learning process, as well as those that are more generally supportive. So two really key questions, and these actually come from Dr. Skelton in her work. And these are some of those million-dollar questions that take a lot of digging deeper into a lot of conversation. So the first one again, so whose interests are being served well by our organization and our systems, and whose are not, and how do we know? And like I say, that's one of those million-dollar questions. So what does it even mean that our interests are being served well? So do we see all of our stakeholders represented? Are all of their interests being considered, and are all of those interests being served? Also, a key piece of this in terms of the how do you know is, are we even contacting, as we're doing our data gathering, are we contacting all of the stakeholders that whose interests we need to meet? And do we even know from their own perspectives what their interests are, and to what extent we're actually meeting them? Okay. And then the whole issue of systems barriers. And when we talk systems barriers, we're talking things such as the policies, the practices, opportunity structures, and so on. So what are those barriers that might be preventing certain groups from being able to access all of the benefits of the educational process, be able to represent it in there, in those, participate in those, and be able to achieve these positive outcomes? So again, are there barriers that we need to address? And again, have we talked to, are we just assuming what those barriers might be, or are we actually talking to the stakeholders that are represented in our constituency to find out from their perspectives what those barriers might actually be? And might we also engage with them in helping to address the barriers? This also kind of gets back to that whole child piece. So when we talk about the support of the entire community, oftentimes community organizations outside of the school can help us address some of those barriers as well. So that is just a really quick trip through the vision and mission and beliefs, and then also through the MICIP mindset. So before going on to the actual process, I'm just going to give you maybe 2 minutes or so just to kind of reflect yourselves. And if you'd like to jot some ideas down, that's fine. But just based on what I've mentioned before in these few questions, anything that really that really sticks to you, anything that causes you to pause. And again, when we get to our groups in a little bit, we'll have an opportunity to have conversation about those. So just think, just reflect individually for a moment. So next, what I'd like to do is I'd like to move on to the actual components of the cycle. So again, you see that equity is that lens through which we're looking at these individual components. And again, as we've said before, the entire cycle is contextualized in that mission, vision, and beliefs, which again gets back to how critical both the organizational as well as the personal vision, the personal beliefs of the members of the organization are as well, because that even affects how we look at the specific elements of the individual cycle. So first of all, talking about the assess needs process, and as those of you who've been participating in the sessions over the last 4 times, we are well familiar with the assess needs process. So again, just highlighting what those specific steps are. So then I've pulled out just what I'll call 4 key questions around assess needs, okay? So again, this first one, so how might we, and again, this one comes from Dr. Skelton as well. So this is kind of the approach, the mindset piece as well. So as we're thinking about assess needs, how might reframing that inquiry process from focusing on the students as the problem, so kind of looking at it as its needs and its student needs and they're the issue, to really focusing on systemic inequities, whether that's the classroom, the school, the district, or the state levels, and how might looking at it from a systems perspective and potentially systems barriers affect the kind of data that we collect and how it's collected. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be collecting individual student data, but are we doing it with the lens of the students being the issue? And are we are we avoiding this systems data? And this really points out why it's so critical to collect that systems data as well. Kind of along that same lines, so when we look at, say, the achievement data, are we looking at it in isolation? Are we looking at it from all the same standard, or are we looking at it from what we call that opportunity gap lens as well? So how are students performing? And this kind of starts to get at root cause. How are students performing relative to the opportunities that they have had? And again, do we provide students supports for what they need so that they have equal opportunities to realize success? Okay. This then again translates to that collecting data on both students' needs and assets. And it's really nice to say that, yes, we want to look positively using assets, but are we capable of being able to look through that asset lens, especially from students who are different from us? So do we know enough about who they are as individuals to even be able to recognize what assets might look like from their perspectives, especially if those are perspectives other than our own? And then finally, again, as it ties to that root cause process, to what extent is our root cause process bias-free? And again, kind of wraps back to that first one. Are students the problem, or are we willing to look at our own biases and assumptions in terms of what we choose as root causes, including, are we willing to look at ourselves for potentially root causes? Okay. So again, all of these are million-dollar questions. These aren't questions that you're going to sit down and say, yes, we're willing to look beyond ourselves. So what does that really mean? Okay. Again, as I said, these are not questions that you're going to have a quick 5 to 10 minute conversation about, but these really get at the heart of equity and the assess needs process. And again, what's the data? Not only are we saying yes or no, but what's the data that supports how we answer these types of questions? So there are many others, as I said earlier, that get into more specifics, into a deeper level, a deeper grain size around the assess needs process. But these are just some of those key questions that as we're engaging in that process, we need to consider. So then moving on to the planning process. And again, these are the key steps in the planning process, and we've been engaged in those for the last few weeks as we've engaged in this professional learning. So again, there are many questions at various grain sizes that we could address, but what I've again tried to do is to really pull out what I'm calling the key questions. So as we're engaging in planning for addressing what the data says, again, if we've collected that data around systems, so as part of our planning process, and again, these need to be part of the plan. We can't just say, yes, we're committed to it, but not actualize those. So we need to put together action plans relative to not only some of the student data, but to the systems data as well. So again, you see that first question about changes to policies, practices, structures, and opportunities that are going to address any system inequities, as well as address barriers that might be part of the system that don't provide equitable opportunities for our students or our adults. And this next one is the strategies about ensuring that all students have access to the kinds of learning activities, the curriculum, culturally responsive curriculum and instruction, as well as with resources that reflect the diversity of the student body. So we know how important it is for students to see themselves in the resources. That's a critical piece, but that's also, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Simply purchasing materials that show a variety of diversities is not enough if we engage and teach the curriculum the way that we've always done it, and if we don't bring up some of the tough topics in the context of curriculum as well. That third bullet there, again, talks about some of the disproportionality. So how do we make sure that all students get that quality tier 1 instruction, and that those that truly need it do get the tiers 2 and 3, but that those are that student groups are not disproportionately represented in there. So based on our own internal assumptions about students and student groups, we automatically assign them to tiers 2 and 3 without really understanding whether or not they actually need it. And if they do, then are we giving them the support that we need? Fourth bullet there talks about having high expectations for all students. And again, this is a very personal thing in terms of our looking at ourselves internally and saying, so are we providing those, what we're calling those deep learning experiences? It's connected to some of the higher level thinking that say as part of the Bloom's taxonomy, but it's not only that as well. So are we giving all students access to that? Because not only does that impact their current learning, but down the road, as we extend the learning trajectory out, that's going to impact as they get into, say, secondary education, opportunities to engage in some of the higher level courses and so on in high school and even beyond. So this piece really has connections all the way through the learning experience. We've already talked really about that sufficient and equitable distribution of resources, but again, as that's part of the planning process, how do we ensure that not only for adults, but not only for students, but for adults as well? And as we look across the entire context of our district, are the highest needs schools and students getting the resources that they need to be able to learn at a level maybe of those buildings or that don't have as much as much resource. And that also gets, and you notice that human resources is in there as well. That also gets to that whole issue of, so are we providing the students with greatest needs with educators that have the highest amount of skills? Okay. And then finally, gets at, because the monitoring and evaluation is designing that as part of the planning process. So what data are we going to actually collect as part of our monitoring and evaluation process to ensure not only the equity in the systems, getting back to that systems piece, but and in the outcomes for students as well, but then also to prevent those unintended consequences from disproportionately affecting certain student groups as opposed to others. So again, many other questions that could be asked in terms of the grain size, in terms of the details, but these are some of those higher level considerations as part of the planning process. And then finally, in terms of implement, monitor, and evaluate. So as we've hopefully designed a plan that addresses the things that we have just talked about, then it comes back to that monitoring process. So are we implementing those strategies as planned, and have those barriers been addressed? Have those problematic policies and practices and structures been addressed? And are all the students equal or equitably benefiting from the strategies and any changes that we're making? And again, what's the evidence? How do we know? Okay. What does our data tell us? And as I mentioned before, are we actually gathering perception data? So not only are we gathering outcome data, but are we also gathering that perception data from those who are actually affected by the policies and practices, especially the educational teaching and learning practices that we've put in place as designed in our plan? And then certainly the result of that is, so what must be adjusted based on our data? So again, this has been a really quick trip through the not only the mindset, but through the cycle as well. As I said, there are many other deeper level questions, and we are in the process of putting together trainings that go much more in depth around this, and providing supports to our ISD partners, who are also going to be leading this work with a lot of our districts, as well as will be a lot of resources on our website. As you know, MDE is hiring for a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this work will be coordinated with that as well. So with that, that fast trip through just kind of an overview of this work, what I'd like to have you do is I'd like to put us into groups where we have just about maybe 10 minutes or so, and maybe have conversation just around these two questions. So first of all, so what are key takeaways from today's presentation? Again, I realize it's just a high-level overview, but if there was one or two things that really kind of hit you as part of that presentation, what might that be? And then as you consider your own setting, whether that's in a district setting, whether that's in an ISD setting, so what's one thing that you might do to support equity work in whatever arena you're engaged in? If you're an ISD person with the districts that you're working with, if you're a district in your local district, recognizing that this is going to be driven by where districts are, the level of engagement they've already had around this, or if there's none, where do you even start with this? So again, Frank, if you would, for maybe 10 minutes, just to engage. We're not asking you to record your thinking around this, but just to engage in this conversation. I realize that 10 minutes is not much time to engage in this conversation at all, but hopefully you were able to share one or two takeaways with each other. What I'd like to have you do is just to take a moment before I share a few resources, just maybe put something in the chat, either something brilliant that you thought of and said, something that one of your colleagues said, just any kind of reflection that you might have had as part of either what I presented or your conversation. So just take a moment to throw something in the chat, if you would. And go ahead and we'll not wait till everybody has done it. So just go ahead and put something in there and give each other a chance to just kind of see what some of our takeaways or our thoughts are. So a couple of wonderings about whether or not these are going to be embedded in the process guide, and yes, they are. This summer, we're going to do an update of the guide, including adding these questions to that. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. So just a couple other quick things, a moment. So again, there are many, many resources that can support this work. And I just wanted to share a few of them with you, those that are probably most accessible in terms of not having to spend hours and hours digging through them. This first resource is one that our superintendents are actually engaged with as well. One thing that I really like about it, and I don't know if you can see that fine print on the screen or not, but talks about leaps for equitable 21st century learning. And it's kind of like an out with the old, in with the new. So on the left side, you see a listing of what are called inequitable industrial area learning descriptions. And then on the right side, in contrast to that, the equitable 21st century learning characteristics. So in the link at the bottom, you'll see this sheet, but you'll also see an expanded document that addresses each one of these individually and goes a little bit more into depth. So helpful resource there. A second one really gets at resource equity. So that was just one of the pieces that we brought up in terms of how do you look at your resources to help ensure that everyone gets what they need, not just what everyone else has. And so this is a great accessible resource in terms of looking at equity. And you notice it's divided into 10 dimensions. Couple more. First of all, some of you may have seen the ASCD book around building equity policies and practices to empower all learners. Fisher and Fry, who are engaged in lots of other topics, including literacy, were some of the authors of this book. The reason that I brought that up, it's a good book, but at the very end, it contains a set of audit questions that I say, if used judicially, actually I see a word missing there, if used judiciously can help gather, process, and perception data, because as I mentioned, it's critical that we do that, not just from our own perspective, but from the perspective of those that are actually being impacted by maybe lack of equity. And so just one key caution I would make here is frequently we send out surveys and then we kind of wipe our hands and say, okay, I've done what I need to do here. And the critical piece of this obviously is making meaning of the data and addressing the data. And then on the right side here, again, when we're talking about equitable learning environments, how do we approach that? What might be an equitable way to approach that topic? And the last link on there, again, is the actual framework, and then the other resources support that framework with a little bit more detail. And then finally, I've mentioned Dr. Skelton a number of times and the resources that come out of the Midwest and Plains Equity Center. They are having a conference this summer. I believe it's free to attend. They actually have ongoing sessions, monthly sessions around a variety of topics that I have found to be very helpful. But I just wanted to highlight the institute that they have coming up in September. The title is a live link to more information about that, and you'll notice that they're inviting teams to apply to that. So again, if this is something that your own team is considering digging more deeply into, this might be a resource for you. So invite you to take a look at investigate that. So with that, again, the topic is a very involved one. 40 minutes doesn't give it do justice to it, but I'm hoping that at least it may have piqued your thinking and given you maybe some other ideas for consideration as you work either in your own setting or to support districts. So thanks again for participation, and I have my email address at the beginning of the presentation that if you would have more questions or whatever around this work, you will see much more coming out of the department related to equity and the continuous improvement process.